Colleagues Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. So this is episode 38, and we're recording this on September 3rd, 2023.
On this episode, we begin by exploring the future of the Wagner Group, given the death of its leader, Prigozhin. We also look at the slow progress of Ukraine's counteroffensive and whether the conflict is headed towards a stalemate. Then, have we reached peak China? We discuss the causes and implications of China's weakening economy. Finally, we explain what is so concerning about Republican presidential hopeful Vivek Ramaswamy's foreign policy proposals. First, who is going to win in this year's fantasy football league?
Well, hopefully not you. That's all. For those that don't know, so Anita we've done this league we're heading into the 12th year. We're actually, the 13th year. And out of the 12, she's won half of them, which is way disproportionate. Yes, it is a small 8-man league, but you're viewed as the Bill Belichick of the league because of your winning ways.
Because I used to have a much higher percentage of wins. And out of the last 4 years, I've lost 3 of them.
No. And the last 4 years, you won 2 of them. So you're at 50%.
You sure about that?
Yes, I'm positive. I just looked at it.
Oh, okay. Well,
so you're still, I know you want to be the underdog or you want to slip into that. You know, hey, don't put so much hate on me, but sorry.
I am.
Sorry. You're still, you're too successful. You're the Patriots, you're the Yankees.
But I'm like the Patriots today because yeah,
it doesn't matter. People still hate the Patriots. People still don't like Bill Belichick, even if the Patriots aren't a threat anymore.
I want to be the Patriots under Tom Brady. Instead, I feel like my strategies are not working out lately.
Well, I will say that you've never gone more than 2 years without winning the championship.
Right.
So I guess the pressure's on for you.
It is. It is. And so I guess we can go on to international relations, world politics. So our first talking point is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And to begin with, on August 23rd, we learned that Yevgeny Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash, along with other top lieutenants of the Wagner Group. It's pretty clear that this was a Putin responsibility. It's, of course, you'll never tie it directly
to him. Not officially, right.
But everybody knows it is. It's thought that a bomb went off, and that's what caused the crash. So on one hand, I think it was a surprise just because people had kind of settled into the surprise of Prigozhin not being killed, right? And so people had been surprised about that. And then it kind of settled into, well, maybe this is, he is that powerful and Putin doesn't want to get rid of him. And then it conformed to the original expectation that, of course, Putin's going to get rid of anyone who challenges his leadership that directly.
Yeah, I think it was that delay and the seemingly Putin laid out this hard line, basically labeling him and the group as an enemy of the state, that they were going to be banished under the deal to Belarus. But then within weeks, we talked about it, he was back at the Russia-Africa summit, meeting with high-level African leaders in St. Petersburg. And then right before, so he's actually coming back from a trip in Africa where obviously Wagner has massive operations. And that was his first, I think, official appearance on Telegram, on social media channels since the event. And it was there, then after coming back, flying into St. Petersburg, but then going from St. Petersburg to Moscow, that the plane was targeted. And
Yeah, about the delay. I mean, I was hearing or reading something this week that talked about, well, that's how Putin usually operates. And that was kind of what people hadn't gotten, being surprised that Prigozhin was still alive, is that Putin never reacts right away, that he gives them a couple months, maybe even makes it seem like it's all good, we're partners now. And then, then you're gone.
Is that just like a form of psychological torture where you're terrified for a long enough period of time before and think you're safe and then poop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it takes a little bit to have totally covert operations because you want to let your guard down.
Yeah, I will say, because I think the initial speculation was it was just completely out in the open, the Russian military using a surface-to-air missile to shoot down the jet. But then U.S. intelligence has kind of landed on that it was an internal explosion within the plane, which would take more time to set up kind of a more covert operation like that.
Yeah. Yeah, as former KGB, Putin would be good at covert operations. So that's
definitely more effective than the poisoning, which is about a 50-50.
Yeah, exactly. If that. So the big question is, not only did Prigozhin be killed in that crash, but so were several other top lieutenants of the Wagner group. And so the big questions that remain is what is going to happen to Wagner? Is it going to continue to exist as some sort of separate entity? There are still some lieutenants there. Will anyone take control? Or is Russia going to subsume it and just take over those operations? Speculation by different people, I think, is the argument that was more convincing to me, that Wagner continues to operate in some form, but it's very fractured and no individual will have the kind of power that Prigozhin has. Of course, an op-ed by Sean McFreight of the National Defense University asserts that the real legacy of Prigozhin is the creation of a modern mercenary business model. And this is what I wonder the most what Russia will do about, because it wasn't just about the mercenary military activities, but also the sort of businesses that mine for minerals, such as oil, natural gas, and gold. And how does Russia take that over? Does it need a group like Wagner to do that, or can it directly those operations? I mean, I think that's kind of the space where I would see Wagner continuing to operate in, or some other. But I think the reason why no leader has come out is no one wants to be targeted by Putin. And so I don't think a leader will take control of Wagner until they feel like they're truly in with Putin, that Putin's not going to just try to decapitate them as well.
Yeah, and maybe it shows also, I mean, it's been reported, I mean, he's increasingly, since COVID, increasingly alienated and on his own. So he doesn't necessarily have within his core group like a loyal enough lieutenant, which Prighozin was, he's his personal chef years ago, to take over these operations. But I can't help but think it can't be direct control by the Russian state because of what we talked about last time on the plausible deniability and being able to operate with such a free hand within Africa at relatively low cost. It still has to be a private operator. So I don't know if maybe it does get more carved up with different lieutenants where the power is diluted, which you alluded to with the quote by Katrina Dox from CSIS. Whether you have, part of the operations within like East Africa are handed here, West Africa and the Middle East are handed to a different lieutenant that still fits under kind of the Russian state, but not really. I mean, they still have to have that sort of vague, cloudy operation where it uses Russian military equipment to a certain extent and Russian intelligence, but isn't officially part of the Russian military and state apparatus.
Yeah, so it's very murky about what will happen. It's very murky about what is happening now. There are some signs that they're trying to take control of the military operations, but there's some signs that they have not done so. So it's really opaque right now from the West observing. And yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I guess we'll just stay tuned. It's obviously, as we talked about, an organization that had a lot of power in Africa, particularly, and then keeping Russia-African ties and how Russia will deal with that is interesting. I know you have a comment here too. I'm just looking about the implications for semiconductor renewable manufacturing.
Yes. I mean, I thought that was one of the interesting points. I wanted to get your take on it too, whether this was accurate or not. But in that op-ed piece today from Sean McFreight at the National Defense University, he talks about the implications of having these greater number of mercenary groups operating in these weak nation states within Africa, and in particular around mining operations and the increasing importance of rare earth minerals, and the fact that in both the Congo region of Africa or even Afghanistan, these represent some of the largest deposits of lithium and other strategic minerals, and kind of implies that, this could be for a Wagner or Russia operating, that it eventually could become a real choke point within the global supply chain. But I think what I really kind of wonder about that, one, the coordination, and then two, I mean, for it to be the commodity itself, real poor margins, and it's more the processing of those rare earths, which would or would not likely be done within these countries. Was that
processing is done in China,
right? So these would be then sold to a Chinese company that would be imported into China, then processed.
If China wanted to operate in these circumstances, and they might not be interested, because as much as these may be the largest deposits, there's a lot of places that have large lithium deposits. One of them is Chile, I believe. And so there's some contest between China and the US who will develop those lithium resources. And of course, there's quite a few states, including my home state, Arkansas, that have significant lithium deposits as well.
Yeah, so it really doesn't imply, and I would think in most of these places that the infrastructure isn't ideal for kind of the transport of these large, low margin ores out anyway. So it's not, I think it's the mistake of, and maybe it's the name of rare earth minerals, implying that they're rare. And in reality, they're not. So it doesn't seem like, I just didn't buy into that sort of threat.
I think
point of the argument.
Because of the importance of lithium, you're seeing articles all over the place about the U.S. and allies trying to secure supplies that are not dependent on China. And the biggest thing will be is if the U.S. can create processing plants to process these rare earths, because that's the part that's the real, China supplies 60% of the raw minerals, but that's down from 90% just a decade or so ago. But they still process about 90% of all. So if the minerals that we dig up here in the U.S. then go to China to be processed.
Right, because of the costs and then the environmental impact. I mean, they don't have the same environmental standards in China.
Wasn't that more with the extraction?
No, it's the processing.
Oh, it is the processing.
Yeah, because Australia has been able to extract. They've been a big chunk of that, 20, 30% in the supply. And they have environmental standards just as strict as the U.S.
Yeah, so figuring that out, I think the problem is it's just going to cost more, and can businesses fit that bill? There's a lot of what we see as the solution to Chinese bottlenecks. And it's well, we can solve that problem, but it's going to cost more. And who's accepting that higher cost?
Right.
So I know you also wanted to talk about the counteroffensive, where that stands.
Yeah, so there's definitely been, over the last month, there's been a lot of backbiting, I think, with U.S., Ukraine, and European allies around what's perceived as a disappointing progress within the counteroffensive. That's especially prior to events of the last week, which have been a little bit more optimistic than what we've seen since the counteroffensive began on June 20th of this summer. And I think really what drove some of that backbiting was a U.S. intelligence assessment reported by the Washington Post on August 17th that predicted that Ukraine will fail to meet its offensive key goal of reaching the Sea of Azov, and in particular the strategic city of Mariupol, and really putting the blame on the Ukraine's unwillingness to follow Western strategy, or what they've been recommending, to really focus their forces and take heavy casualties on a single push in order to push through the many Russian defensive lines. So there's a lot of criticism of that leak and assessment within as undermining the approach towards Ukraine. And obviously, we've seen a weakening of support from the U.S. public in terms of Poland, in terms of additional funds going in. And we saw it reflected in the Republican primary debate, where there was a clear split amongst candidates on further support for Ukraine. So that being said, within the last week, there's definitely been renewed optimism. And it's really seen by a breakthrough along one of those fronts. And there's been two main fronts. One is targeting what the U.S. intelligence agencies kind of criticized was the advance toward Metropol, and then the other one toward Mariupol, which is a little bit to the east.
I would say very modest optimism.
Yeah, but I think it
didn't make it very far.
It doesn't look impressive on the map itself, but the fact that they made it through one line, that they took this village of Robotyne within a relatively short period of time, 9 days of fighting, and have been able to hold it, it means that they have the biggest kind of push that they've had. And if you look at the map, which the Institute of War has provided, the defensive lines are really concentrated towards the fronts as they existed at the beginning of the summer. So once they're able to kind of establish this beachhead, they have a much better chance of breaking through. It's really the first 20 miles. So they have 60 miles in total, 70 miles or so in total to make it to the Sea of Azov. And it's really that first 20 miles that can they establish kind of that beachhead and break through.
How far have they made it so far?
Yeah, they made it through the first defensive line, which is a big push, and they've reached the second. Well, the whole point is it's concentrated in 20 miles. So they've made it 5 to 10 miles in. And it's really, making it past the second line of defense. And then the next critical city will be this Tokmak, which we talked about last time, which is also encircled by rounded fences. And they're making slow but steady progress. I mean, there's been a lot of comparisons on same criticisms of Western allies after the D-Day landing and how slow the progress was in pushing back German forces. So I think there's a lot to that of, giving them time. The interesting piece, excellent reporting from the New York Times, which had frontline reporters with some of the Marine units on the other front. And they just talked a lot about just how high morale was among Ukrainian troops. And polling shows that there is zero desire to negotiate and still 100% committed to the full defeat of Russia. And when you have a country and a military still that committed to the operation, despite the casualties that they're incurring, it's hard to deny them the time in order to execute it.
Yeah, we'll get more into that. I think, though, 100% is that you can't really dissent right now. You're considered very unpatriotic if you feel any amount of negotiation or anything like that. So, of course, it's 100%.
I mean, that's the polling side. I guess you could, it's done by Western firms anonymously, and it definitely has fluctuated over the period. And we'll talk about it a little with the New Yorker piece. It's really the atrocities that were committed by the Russian military that were revealed, particularly in the early stages of the war. I mean, that's really galvanized the people. And I thought the most interesting quotes coming from Ukrainian leadership around kind of this annoyance around the U.S. saying, certain elements of the U.S. saying, give up certain amounts of your territory for peace. And given the analogy of, why don't you give up part of Alaska to Russia? We're giving up parts of the West Coast to California. I mean, it's something that's unimaginable.
No one's occupying it either.
No, but do you think Americans would if it was occupied for the last year?
Are used to being the predominant military. So, I mean, they're not relying on
so national sovereignty isn't important to the Ukrainians? I mean, it's
of course it is.
Yeah. And then the legitimate war crimes and atrocities being committed. I mean, mass graves constantly discovered. So that, to me, is the most compelling. The fact that morale so high on the front line, despite the casualties, they're fighting under conditions that no Western military would fight under because of the lack of air support. but they're still making progress. They're making breakthroughs, but it's not what we saw last fall with the territorial gains yet. But the economists made a good point of they are making steady progress, but once they reach that breakthrough point, then you're going to see the massive gains because the Russian defenses will collapse after a certain point.
Yeah. Let me give the counterpoint to this because I think there just needs to be some representative of the other side. The other side said this is taking a very long time. You can't have a counteroffensive that goes on forever. And can you get to that point while you still have a counteroffensive?
It's been like 2 months. That's like zero time
No, not really.
in a war.
Particularly with the resources that they have. They're using up all their manpower. They put all the reserves in it. They don't have very many reserves.
They've only begun to commit some of the reserves. They still have significant reserves to draw upon.
Well, one of the articles said there was a significant amount of reserves already being committed. I think, or there's at least one side that thinks that this will end up as a stalemate, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley.
And that's the criticism. Of course, U.S. intelligence has also been wrong on a number of occasions. They were wrong about the defense of Kiev. I think we're underestimating the resiliency of the Ukrainian people and their willingness to continue to fight, to take heavy casualties.
But this is like based on just objective military.
Yeah, so was the other one. So was the other assessment about the collapse of Kiev in 3 days. I mean, they've clearly been wrong in the past of the capabilities and assessment. So giving them more time, I think it's likely that the counteroffensive won't end seasonally either. I think Ukraine will continue to push on even as the weather turns colder.
Do they have the resources to do that? They do not currently have the resources to continue the counteroffensive into late fall, winter.
I think maybe the pace of operations, but if they do end up achieving, even if they get within like a few miles towards the end of the fall of Mariupol or Metropol, that would be a huge success. I see them probably continuing the operation because then, especially as more long-range equipment, and we have continued to push. I mean, the F-16s have been approved. They'll begin training on that. And then the longer-range artillery missiles have also been approved. So I think it's being patient, giving them more time. I think what happened this week is important showing that they can break through these defenses given the time and the resources, and it's just continuing to supply them. And I would go back to the ROI on this is extraordinary compared to the billions and billions that we wasted in Iraq and Afghanistan. In terms of a monetary resource and keeping them supplied, the ROI on this is unbelievable. So the U.S., I think, would be a little crazy not to continue to commit towards this.
Well, okay. So I just want to say, first of all, I don't actually disagree with anything that you've said. I do think you take the very most optimistic side, the very extreme opposite side, without considering any of the criticism. But two, I don't think this is about whether the U.S. should continue to support Ukraine.
Well, right? Ultimately, it is. It does go to that argument because that's the very argument. If a Republican is elected in 2024, we know what wing of the party it will be from. And support for Ukraine will end.
I mean, I'm just saying the people who are less optimistic than you aren't saying, oh, we should stop supporting Ukraine. I think right now there's no room for negotiations because Ukraine continues to make some slow progress. Whether how substantial it will be, as you point out, we can't tell yet. We can't tell yet, even though your optimism, I think we don't know. I think it's an unknowable at this point. I think, and as long as that goes on, of course, we continue to support them full on within our ability to support resources. I think, though, one has to think about what if this does end up in a stalemate, what do we do then? And I think, as I see it, is at some point, but this will be far in the future because I think to be able to sufficiently put pressure on Ukraine to join negotiations, I think it has to be much farther in the future. I think there has to be a stalemate this last months before they will even consider negotiations, no matter how much pressure we put on them. You have negotiations while you're still fighting. I think nothing precludes that. I don't think you have to stop.
Russia's shown no willingness to negotiate at this point either.
Right. So there's that eventuality, but I think we're talking about a far eventuality. I think there's no signs right now that there's any room for negotiations, which is what people are kind of arguing about.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think when we've talked about this months before, I mean, I think the actual end game is something more akin to pushing back to the pre-war borders as the negotiated solution. But it's the people willing to give up an additional 15% of Ukrainian territory, of not allowing the counteroffensive to continue so that it can legitimately threaten Crimea, and for Russia to be staring at a complete loss, that there's no ability to negotiate, and certainly no willingness from Ukraine, and no incentive for Russia until that moment arrives. So there can be no stalemate, or we shouldn't accept a stalemate. And I don't think Ukraine would accept negotiations until it's at that point where it's legitimately back to the pre-war 2022 borders. Well,
but we don't know for sure if you can get there, and you may have to try to negotiate there, because there's no guarantee that the Ukraine has the ability. There's no guarantee that they have the ability to push Russia that far out.
And I think that's the giving them enough time and the supplies in order to do that.
It's not just about giving them enough time. It is you can only push extra manpower and a counteroffensive.
That's for them to judge, though. That's not for us to judge.
Right. But
as long as they're willing to fight, we should supply them to fight.
Right. But at a certain point, they can only fight so much. Like, they can only have new reserves and new troops being sent somewhere for so long.
Yeah, but they're not at that point yet.
No, they're not yet. But when you say give them time.
Yeah, that means another year or two. That's how long it may.
But I'm saying,
I don't think it'll take that long. But
I'm saying, if in 6 months they're entrenched in their spots and they're not moving any, then that's when you kind of at least think about these things.
Yeah, no, I don't agree. I don't disagree with. Yeah, you definitely revisit it within 6 months. But it's people acting like, well, shoot, October's here. Counteroffensive, way short. Let's pack it in.
I don't think there's that many people saying that.
There's enough people saying that.
I don't think. I read the articles too. I don't know people saying that other than like Republican candidates, which we'll get into, which is something totally different. But in general, the experts are not saying, oh, we should pack it up now.
I think it's also labeling it a failure already. I think it's way too premature. There are plenty of people labeling it a failure. That's true.
I just think it's an unknown where you take it as a given that they're going to make all these gains.
I think give them time. This was a major breakthrough this week, and I think it's a positive sign.
Okay. I think we mostly agree on that, but disagree over some minor points. So moving on, what's getting a lot of buzz is China's economic struggles. Have we hit peak China? China is facing some serious headwinds right now. They have a huge debt crisis and a real estate market that is on the verge of collapse, some people would say. Exports have been down for the last 3 months. Imports have been down for the last 5 months. Growth slowed to just 0.8% in the second quarter of this year. There's the problem of prices deflating and how that affects consumer spending, where you don't if prices keep going down, you don't want to spend in the present moment because you keep thinking you can get a cheaper price later. You don't know when that cheapest price is going to hit. Youth unemployment is over 20%, and the hardest hit are those with college degrees. Within these, I just wanted to kind of iterate a little bit that Chinese debt to GDP is about 300%, which is like 3 times the US. US is about 100%. Economists still aren't really sure how that affects your economy, but it could possibly limit the amount of money the government can pour into the economy. But particularly problematic are these possible bankruptcies of the real estate companies. And real estate is one of the places where you've had traditionally a lot of the investment by the Chinese people themselves. And now these are no longer good deals. They're losing part of their wealth, and they're no longer willing to invest in the economy in this way. Deflation is concerning. We saw the effects in Japan over a couple of decades. That is something every economist says is the worst thing your economy can have. A lot of people think, though, that this will reverse itself within a year or so, but it is a particular problem. one of the areas that have been getting a lot of attention is this youth unemployment number. And one of the things that I was listening to a Planet Money episode this week, and one thing that I think that's interesting is it isn't a matter of there not being enough jobs. There's lots of jobs that can't fill, teaching in the countryside, but particularly manufacturing labor, which is making it hard to produce enough exports. But these are not the jobs that were promised. You have these college-educated people who are promised white-collar sort of jobs. I mean, one of the problem is the insistence of being a manufacturing economy means that you're not transitioning to a more service-based economy, which provides a lot of those white-collar jobs. The other interesting thing that I hadn't thought about was how you have all these only children who can afford not to participate in the economy. They can say, I'm not going to take a job that is not this sort of promised job that I have because they're only children. Their parents are happy to support them. They have support from both sides of their family largely. So they have a lot of freedom in whether to participate in the economy or not. And that's something that I hadn't really thought about. And the problem with them deciding not to participate in the economy is how it affects economic growth and consumer spending. They're not getting married. They're not buying houses and cars. They're not having children. You have the aging population, and you have all these young people opting not to be in the economy at all. So those are all kind of some significant headwinds that the Chinese economy is facing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I hadn't considered either the issue with only children, being able to support that whole lying flat phenomenon that's going on and become kind of a meme on Chinese social media. But yeah, being able to opt out, it seems like the precursor of a dangerous situation politically, just because in the past, in terms of disruptive social forces, when you have a large, educated, underemployed population that is dissatisfied with society's promised one thing and it hasn't delivered, and they have the education, maybe not in the social sciences and things that typically would lead to revolutionary leadership, since China's been pretty successful in purging that, as some of the foreign affairs articles that I think we'll discuss talking about. But that just seems to me, when you see those two, youth unemployment and educated, that seems like a dangerous combo in the future for something that the Chinese government would be particularly concerned about.
Yeah, I think it's a concern. One reason why I think, though, it may not result in the type of just when you have large, educated, unemployed people, you do see more political tensions. But I think in this case, I think the fact that they're well taken care of, they're not struggling economically, may reduce some of this impetus to rebel.
Yeah, I mean, I think material well-being is definitely part of it, but in terms of the leadership of any revolutionary, it's always the middle class and upper middle class that's educated that leads it. But my concern is that because China's been so successful in terms of cutting out outside foreign influences, that you can't even create another Tiananmen generation. They don't know about outside idea, where they're so caught up in the nationalist project. Control. What's that?
There's so much social control in China.
So much social control, exactly. Yeah. So maybe that's been successfully squelched. And then, yeah, like you said, the material well-being is enough that, it's easier to just like play video games and chat on WeChat all day. I don't know.
Yeah, the Planet Money talked about this girl who was too afraid to like tell her parents in the beginning. So she would get dressed for work, go to the bus stop, and then she would just walk straight to a cafe where she would just draw all day and then come home. She eventually told her parents, and then her parents were like totally okay with it.
Yeah.
But because they had struggled so much, she didn't want to tell them for a long time. So it was a really interesting episode and had a lot of things I didn't consider. But definitely, even if you take out the political side of it, the danger of rebellion, it's still really harmful to the economy.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, this is the opposite of what they want going forward.
And they want and they need so much domestic spending. And all of these forces have decreased spending. It's only like maybe 38% of the economy, which is a really low number.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, I found it shocking to see how high the savings rates, which again, in a lot of Northeast Asian countries, saving rates are much higher than the US. But China is now up to 50% savings rate because there's so much uncertainty around the economy and around government intervention within the economy as well. I thought that was, I think, one of the articles that you'll discuss made that particularly poignant, that COVID created this situation where the level of government intervention and social control at a low level was so severe that now it's created these long COVID effects around the economy.
So let's get into that. So how did China get to where it is today? I mean, one obvious thing that's been talked a lot about is overinvestment in infrastructure. At a certain point, when you have airports with no planes, you have a lot of projects just being abandoned because they know that there's all these apartments and they can't sell
empty
these.
Cities, yeah.
So a lot of projects get abandoned halfway. So that's been a huge problem and increasing the debt and leading to these companies that some of the very biggest real estate companies on the verge of going bankrupt. And there's uncertainty of how much the government will, how much money they may continue to pump into the economy or into these companies to prevent them from going bankrupt. Nobody knows.
Yeah, and it's been tragic at the personal level too, because you had people that have prepaid for in full these condos and apartment complexes that just don't get finished and they're not getting their money back. And that's 80% of their life savings.
Yeah, and that's going to lead to a trend that we're talking about, why now there's not investment in the economy and preference for cash savings. But before we get there, I wanted to follow up on your zero COVID policies. One thing, and I don't know how much this affects the economy. I haven't seen any numbers, but there is the fact that foreign companies, because of supply chain issues, started to move some of their factories to India, Vietnam, and Mexico. This also has to do with the rising cost of labor in China as well. But the biggest thing is, I don't remember what article this was in, but the idea, I think it was in several, the idea that there's been an eroded trust of the government promise to stay out of their lives. So if they were not engaging in any sort of political activities, there was the idea that they would have freedom, their economic freedom, government would stay out. And because of the draconian sort of measures that were put in place, did intervene in very almost intimately in households, and it kind of eroded a lot of trust that the government would not do that.
Yeah, because these lockdowns are much more severe, you saw videos of like Shanghai, and there were the complaints on not being able, because they were dependent on the government delivering literally to their apartments food and pharmaceutical drugs. Yeah, it was extremely draconian. And
beyond that too, it was sort of, you didn't get warning. It was just like,
yeah, it was just sudden. Yeah.
Right. You would, within a couple hours, all of a sudden, everything would be locked down and you had no warning that was going to happen.
And then it was rolled back with a similar sense of kind of arbitrariness, just like how sudden the shift from extreme lockdown to opening everything up, which I think the article that you're referring to was, I think the one by Adam Posen and Foreign Affairs. And the suddenness was such that you probably had at least 1 million deaths, which obviously weren't reported or covered up. So you're dealing with kind of that trauma as well of the government, and it being clear that it's this arbitrary nature of the party, either of Xi or just the standing committee that makes these very intimate decisions.
And I think you've seen beyond COVID and more recent policies, you've seen a long-term consolidation of Xi going after more private enterprises. So, going pretty hard on the tech industry, but also, rules about schools for like learning English or after high school schools, all kinds of different aspects of the economy She has gone after. And that increases uncertainty and businesses being built and invested, the increased social control that I talked about. All this has dampened the idea of households and businesses actually investing right now,
right,
and preferring just having cash savings instead of buying that new house or buying a car. So one of the things I thought was interesting, I forget who said this. This was like I was reading on Twitter, but a lot of the problems of the economy date before COVID, but were just covered up because you had such high manufacturing growth. So I think some of that is true, that some of these economic pressures that are coming to bear have always been there. But now, because exacerbated by COVID and manufacturing exports being down, now we're just seeing these sort of cracks in the economy that have always been there.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of this peak China theory has, of course, been out there for a long time. And a number of people, including like Brett Stevens, who is doing a slam dunk in his in the op-ed piece, which he has consistently put out, every couple of years about how China is peaking and all of this. So I think there seems to be a real floodgates, with the policy analyst community within China experts. There's been so much on drawing the illusion between Japan and China, and that China is now going through the same experience. But also, to your point, that this began in 2015, 2016, in the early years of Xi, and that this isn't just a reflection of COVID, post-COVID thing, but rather is a long time coming, and now it's kind of reached its crisis point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this growing sense of peak China, though, I'm not sure where it really leads, because I don't think it leads to different policies. I think the same competitive policies are certainly there. So I'm not really sure what the consequences of the argument are, because if you truly believe peak China, then you may not worry about the competition as much.
Yeah, maybe there's a little bit less concern, but then the potential for danger in terms of military conflicts probably increases, right?
Right. So what does it mean? One of the things, people point out, the U.S. should not be so excited about this because we do still sell quite a bit to China, and it means China's not going to be buying those things, and that it's going to have a negative effect on overall global growth. China buys like a huge commodity market. It actually worsens trade deficits. So the imports have been down for 5 months longer than its exports have been down. So basically, it means China's not buying stuff. It's not helping to fuel global economic growth. And when the global economy suffers, again, that's another way the U.S. suffers. So a couple of people have been making this point, like you shouldn't be too excited about this economic downturn in China because it's going to have consequences in the U.S. And like I said, it doesn't help our trade deficits. It probably makes it worse.
Yeah, that being said, I mean, the U.S. is largely driven by domestic demand. And so we're shielded to a certain extent by that. And then the total value of our exports to China compared to like a Canada or Mexico, also relatively small, or the EU. Those are far more important markets than China for the U.S.
Okay, so let's say that it will affect the U.S. directly, but let's say that it's as small as you assume it is. It affects Europe. Well, Europe buys stuff from the United States too. So if Europe's economy slows down because of it, then, or Canada or Australia, then that hurts where American exports would be going to. People forget we do actually sell quite a few things.
We do, but it's still also, we're driven by domestic demand. And as long as that's robust, then it's a marginal impact compared to something else. Because I've definitely seen articles that, I've seen now we shouldn't celebrate, but that the actual drag on the U.S. economy, relatively modest.
I think the effect of the global drag will exacerbate anything on the U.S.
Could be.
Yeah. But as you were saying, there's one of the arguments about peak China from the beginning is that it actually makes China more dangerous. So this could happen in two ways. One, if there's a lot of economic discontent towards the party, you could have rallied the flag, sort of nationalists maybe be more provocative or more willing to engage in conflict that way. The other peak China argument is that China may want to lock in the gains it has now. If it sees like this is the height of its power, then it wants to lock those gains in. And so that would mean taking Taiwan now, there wasn't a good chance of taking Taiwan in 10 years or something. It makes China more dangerous, but those arguments aren't very convincing to me. I do think if the economy gets worse than it is now, I do worry about nationalism, rally the flag. But I still don't think that Taiwan would be the target. I don't think that they are prepared right now to take Taiwan. And I think...
Yeah, not right now, but by 2027.
Well, but if the economy is even worse, I mean, how do you keep those preparations?
No, there's no reason they can't continue. I mean, if they have to increase the debt sum, they're going to prioritize. She has been conditioning since at least COVID for the Chinese people to take this period of suffering and sacrifice. There's a clear long-term strategy of conditioning people to accept material suffering for the good of the nation. So I think all of this is being
but are people
built.
willing to do that? Is a whole other story.
I think within a certain extent. I mean, they're willing to, the youth, if they have a base level of material well-being, they're going to be fine with that. But I think it is a narrow window. So I feel like this gives more credence to the people concerned about like the next 10 years or so.
Yeah. There was a White House official speaking to us, and I was just so amazed because he was saying, oh, I really don't believe in this 2027. He's like, I don't believe that China will take Taiwan by force, that they gain from threatening to do so, but ultimately it's not in their interest. I was like, oh my gosh, those are exactly the feelings that I have. And someone validated that. I keep trying to make that case. So I think there's an outside chance. I think these numbers are high, but if there's a 5% chance of conflict, then if the economy worsens, deflation becomes serial like it was in Japan, then that might move it to like 10%.
Yeah, and I'd put that 10% higher at least.
Yeah, everyone else.
All of this.
Everyone else seems to do it, so why not you? And finally, you mentioned Adam Posen. He wrote a good foreign affairs article on this. He's an economist, so he has a lot of interesting insights. But he also, the stuff that he was talking about the U.S. should be doing are things, of course, that we've said the same on previous episodes. So basically, he talks about how when real estate and other investments are not paying off right now in China, then there is incentives then to put any of your money into foreign investments. And that we should be encouraging those investments in our own economy. And one of the things that has prevented that from happening is all our laws against foreign investment coming from China. Now, those laws, though, are supposed to be in areas of national security. And he also talks about there's still reason to restrict certain sectors of critical technologies. The biggest question is, what is a critical technology and how you can make that very broad or you can make that very narrow. And I think he's arguing for a more narrow definition. But something we've talked about, particularly, is there's a lot of incentives of being able to attract that labor and innovation, particularly through the students, attracting, instead of this trend of like being suspicious of all Chinese students who want to come to the United States, to encourage that for them to come to the US and then benefit from their labor and their contributions to innovation. And that basically, he says, like, she's doing our work for us. Like, he's driving out, creating the conditions that is driving out foreign investment money and students and labor and innovation. And our policies are preventing us from taking advantage of that when that's exactly what we should be doing.
Yep. No, I read that and 100% agreement with that. I mean, I think it's a unique opportunity right now for the U.S. really to make a strategic play, given, the 20% youth unemployment, given the increasing intrusiveness and restrictions at top Chinese universities, which really have been, and we argue in our War of the Rocks piece, has really been an engine of innovation and growth. These that adopted a more Western liberal model within the boundaries of the university, but that's been disappearing over the last 10 years. So you really have this great opportunity to take advantage of this and to bring those in. And it's just a shame that the Biden administration hasn't done enough to reverse some of the damaging Trump policies that were implemented around students and student visas.
Very frustrating. Like Republicans, never going to do that. And if we can't get a Democratic administration to see those things, instead just buying into more and more of this, like, every way China is dangerous. I mean, he points out that most of the IP thefts and espionage, in our article, we point out, well, there's measures to check that and prevent that. And it's very, very rare. And it's mostly from people who were educated in graduate degrees in China, not in the United States. But he points out, too, that a lot of the intellectual property theft is through cyber crimes and industrial espionage. It used to be forced technology transfer, but much more less than those type of business practices anymore. So mostly it's crime, and you have ways to deal with crime and preventing crime. So I thought it was really important, and I guess we can just keep trying to plug it. But it's disappointing that the U.S. does not seem to be following those recommendations.
Yeah, especially when it can be framed in this way of this is just another element of weakening the Chinese Communist Party. It's taking advantage of Xi's very flawed policies, and our allies have benefited from it. I mean, Canada, the UK have seen huge influxes of Chinese students at their universities. Canada certainly has a much more flexible policy towards a pipeline from student visa to the workforce. And yeah, we really need something similar here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, next there was a debate among a Republican presidential hopefuls that we actually watched. And one thing that's really come out of this is Vivek Ramaswamy. Did I say that right?
Yeah, I don't know if I can pronounce it either.
I think journalists have had a lot of practice with this, trying to say it, but he kind of has emerged out of it. And he has some really interesting foreign policy views. I would say my react is more, well, I want to react with alarm, but I'm struggling because mostly I just read it and it's like, this makes no sense to me and this is a bunch of nonsense. But you've been trying to explain to me why I need to take this seriously.
Yeah, because this really, if you look at the top three contenders within the Republican primary right now, so obviously Trump with the dominant lead, followed by DeSantis, and then Ramaswamy. These are all essentially America firstists. This is still the foreign policy of the Trump administration being further refined, being further pushed to the right. And I think that's what we saw kind of on the debate stage and then on his article that he published last week in the American Conservative is a continuation of America first, but going even more extreme because they're trying to out-extreme each other in order to stand out a little bit and from Trump while still honoring Trump and his emperor greatness. But they're trying to out-Trump each other between DeSantis and Ramaswamy in terms of all sorts of policies, but particularly on the foreign policy side.
The thing about his foreign policy is that he says these are the things that he's going to do. But say he was president, he can't do those things because the world doesn't work the way that he wants it to.
Yeah, that doesn't matter. I think
he literally can't be president and be like, okay, this is my foreign policy strategy, because those things wouldn't happen. They just are not, right? They're just like the stuff he's like, the allies have to be sending their navy to protect certain, and we're going to tell them to invest in these Polynesian islands and things like that. It's
right.
They're not going to do it just because you ask them to. Like, what incentives are you giving them?
Yeah, for somebody who, and we'll probably take a step back and go a little bit into just give an overview of his background. So I would encourage everybody, we'll provide a link for the New York Times recent Upshot podcast, but it provided a good...
The Daily.
Oh, Daily, sorry, the Daily. It provided a very good background on him, but just in short, so Ramaswamy is the son of Indian immigrants. They settled in Cincinnati. After he attended Harvard, majoring in biology, and then going to Yale Law School, he made his money really by setting up a company in the bioscience sphere that purchased patents from major pharma companies that essentially had let these patents expire. And actually, his company had pretty good success. I mean, they brought 5 actual new drugs to the market via the strategy, and they were able to produce them much lower. So that's why the economics work. But actually, most of his wealth came from his salesmanship. And I think it's his charisma and salesmanship that's most impressed the media and pundits, as well as a certain subset of Republican voters.
So a lot of people lost money, but he made money.
He made money the way the contract was structured on this Alzheimer's drug that he hyped to the market. Stock price went way up. And just some way that his contract, even though it failed, some way the way that his own contract was structured, he ended up making $200 million off of it.
So wins people and makes a lot of money off of other people. The thing about that drug is, I think it was Glaxo, I don't remember, but it had already said that drug was ineffective. And so he took that drug and he just boosted it up through pure charisma, and then found out, like, through all the stages, it was ineffective. And so all these people who bought into that lost tons of money.
Yeah. So it's a far more effective,
as a populist, I'm very against this.
Trump, of a Trump pyramid scheme almost.
Yes. That's
on a much, much more successful scale than anything Trump's done, maybe except The Apprentice and some of the branding stuff. But Ramaswamy did this in a very short time. So a very successful young man, was kind of pushed out of his company because of controversial views that he picked up in 2020 following the Black Lives Matter protest. He published his own book called Woke Incorporated, and then became a media figure, particularly on Fox, derailing woke corporations. Right. So that's kind of how he first became.
So he was pushed out because his employees wanted him to make these statements, right, in support of
BLM, right, like a lot of corporations were.
And because he was anti that, that's why they pushed him out of his own company. I don't know how that works, though, but that's what the Daily said.
Oh, how he gets pushed out? Yeah, just the board of directors. Yeah, they would...
So his main platform is this woke companies issue.
Yeah, that's how he rose to prominence. And then has he's run a great ground campaign, very, very online. The New York Times,
might even show up to our podcast if we invited him.
I'm sure if we asked him, yeah, maybe he would.
It's said.
Let us know if you want to see that.
There's 3 or 4.
Want to see Anita going up against Ramaswamy regarding foreign policy? I think that would be fun. But he after the debate appearance basically surged to challenge Ron DeSantis as the potential number 2 within the primary, and like you said, he staked out some pretty interesting foreign policy positions. So I don't know if you wanted to outline your thoughts on the American Conservative article.
I'll just say so. But I also just want to say real quick, for his national platform, the U.S. policy platform, he just wants to get rid of the Department of Education, the IRS, and the FBI.
He wants to sack like 75%. So I think your job's in trouble, honestly.
Probably.
I think you're...
But that's not what's disturbing to me. I mean, why pay, if there's not an IRS, why pay taxes?
Yeah, that's exactly what they want. They want just the states to be, it's just a very loose Articles of Confederation, essentially, arrangement.
And then national crime. I mean, like, think of all the kidnappers. Like, they want a lawless society without the FBI?
No, the states can manage it. Individual states.
They really can't. And what about
militias,
cross-border crimes? I mean, that's what the FBI does. If it's a purely state thing, they allow state.
All the resources that are being absorbed by the Leviathan federal government and now open to the states. So Texas is going to have a lot more money available to itself, even though I'm pretty sure well, they'll invest and they won't be constrained by U.S. laws on implementing the border control. So Texas will be able to take its own laws and do the policy as it deems fit.
But there's actually constitutional law that would prevent them from doing some of that.
No, I think that's up to the Supreme Court. And I think they're confident that everything under the 10th Amendment can be pushed back to the states. So if Texas needs to shoot everybody at the border, which, honestly, they were kind of alluding to in the debate, that's the way you handle it.
Doesn't see a problem with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of his platforms is, if necessary, involving the U.S. military to go after Mexican drug enterprises.
Well, yeah, and DeSantis has been more, he's saying day one, he's sending special forces into Mexico to take out these cartels.
Which
is technically an act of war, but...
Right, exactly. It's technically an act of war. Like, it's a little bit problematic.
Deal about it?
Well, all of a sudden, it will break all kinds of agreements with the United States. That will definitely
That is our actual biggest trading partner. So I think that's...
And
about China, but...
Yeah, there's all kinds of problems with that. And just, in some ways, it's so unthinkable. But, one thing that you're good at is talking more about his ideas about what the Madison Doctrine, Monroe Doctrine, Nixonian realism really is. But basically, one of the most attention-getting of his policies is the trying to pivot to make Russia a wedge between, the U.S. and China. And so he believes that if we allow Russia to keep their gains in Ukraine and promise not for Ukraine to be a part of NATO, and then
capitulation,
right, and that we reduce all the sanctions and we bring them in as a full commercial partner, then and all they have to do is stop their military alliance with China.
Which they don't actually have a formal military alliance, but yeah.
I told you it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, there's a lot of problems with that logic. Like, why doesn't Putin then take over all of Ukraine? How do you keep Putin from doing that? I mean,
right. Yeah, there's all sorts of flaws with this and naivety. But I think in particular around that issue, what I wanted to highlight was, and this isn't something that Ramaswamy just kind of dreamed up, but it dates back to larger policies around America First, around what was being circulated in the early Trump administration Steve Bannon, I guess, is a foreign policy expert and held very high levels within the White House. So we're going to put them both on the same level, Steve Bannon and Henry Kissinger. So starting with Steve Bannon, the more important of the figures.
You should tell Kissinger that. I should.
What's that?
You tell Kissinger that he's on the same level as Steve Bannon.
Exactly. Yeah.
I learned this week that he's 100 years old and he's still doing, giving talks and stuff.
Doing appearances. He did the talk at National Defense University, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm sure he'd be proud to share the stage with Steve Bannon. So Bannon, who we all recall, was the primary author of Trump's America First policy and a former White House advisor and National Security Council member. So these were all fun times, fun years. Has had this background. He was a national security. What's that?
I didn't know he was a national.
He was part of national security member. Yeah, absolutely.
Did not know that.
Absolutely. Yeah, very high level security clearance. So all of this really goes back to the idea and the framing, which isn't necessarily unique to Bannon, but he was the biggest champion of it on the far right. But it's this idea that China represents a civilizational threat. And this is reflected in a 2018 Vanity Fair article that will give some background. And as a civilizational threat, it's natural that Russia, as, especially to an American conservative, as a traditional society, one that's defending religion and traditional hierarchies, and very important, is also a white ethno-state, represents a natural ally to help contain China. He further outlined this too in a pre-White House 2014 talk at the Vatican, and Bannon tied Putin to the defense as a champion of traditional institutions and nationalism, and something naturally opposed to the EU-style kind of globalist cosmopolitanism. So naturally it should, especially to more conservative, the earlier Pope at the Vatican, something appealing to them. Also, funny enough, he went on about the respect that Russia has for national sovereignty, which particularly seems like a joke. Was a joke back in 2014, but now it really seems like a joke. And then naturally, also, it speaks to, on the religious side, particularly to the evangelical right within the U.S. Russia's had a very strong anti-gay, anti-feminist policy as well. So for all these reasons, there's a natural affinity for Russia as a potential ally and this was being actively pushed within the Trump administration at the time.
Important thought that's being missed in this discussion is that why would Russia want to be an ally of the United States? What's in it for Russia?
I think it has to come with giving Russia a free hand up to the NATO, allowing them to reconstitute, including in Central Asia, reconstitute the Soviet Empire. I think if they were given a free hand in that, which obviously includes the Ukraine as well, wouldn't include the Baltic republics.
But
yeah, it would include Georgia. It's not a NATO member.
Yeah.
That would be a willing sacrifice and enough to incentivize Russian cooperation and an anti-China.
But doesn't
defense.
Russia want to reconstitute the Soviet Union to become powerful enough to challenge U.S. hegemony?
Yeah, that's to it. They downplay kind of the threat just because they don't view it as a threat because it's divorced from communism now. What Russia represents within the right now is a strong nationalist that represents traditional values. And in that sense, who cares what Russia...
But they want to challenge the world order, of course. And they want to be a power to challenge the U.S. Why are we going to make them a power so they can challenge
Because China's the greater threat for reasons that I imagine you can read between the lines what they are.
He does know he's Indian, right?
Oh, yeah. That doesn't matter so much in terms of why Ramaswamy is kind of embracing it. But then going back to the ties, because within the American Conservative article, his biggest, he mentions Washington. Again, the idea of isolationism, which he completely divorces from the historical context, the fact that it was a very young country, weak, economically unimportant, not getting involved in complex European affairs makes a lot of sense. But his biggest love affair is with Nixon, and obviously around the wedge policy. And when we talk Nixon, it has to be the architect of Nixon's policy, Henry Kissinger. So according to a 2018 Daily Beast article, so Kissinger advised both Trump and then later Kushner in 2017 to form closer relations with Moscow, basically in a reverse China policy that Kissinger led in the 1970s. And I think the idea was more along the geopolitical context. So
yeah, that was not an uncommon position. maybe still by then
it was still an outside position that wasn't embraced.
We tried to embrace Russia. Bush, was it?
Yeah, it was first. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
He was like, I've looked into his soul.
Yep. Yeah, and Russia
Obama
was seen as an important ally during the war on terrorism. We were aligned in a lot of ways in battling Islamic extremism. And yeah, I think there was that push and hope. Yeah, Putin was going to be a reasonable guy to work with. Obviously, Germany interpreted him as the historic impetus that Russia's always felt, that it feels like it's part of Europe. Mm-hmm. It's always felt inferior to Europe, but it also sees itself as an integral part of Europe. So integrating them within the European economy was seen as natural. By then, of course, you had all the election issues. You had a much more aggressive Russia that had already invaded Georgia, had already taken the Donbass and Crimea in 2014.
By the time
Kissinger's advising this, and now this is kind of outside of the mainstream, I think, foreign policy thought and strategy by then. But nevertheless, Kissinger was pushing it. So the fact that you have, Steve Bannon from kind of the far right.
Did I mention Kissinger's 100 years old?
Yeah. He's saying he's become a crank and he's not giving the best advice. Is that?
Maybe I'm saying he's not giving the best advice.
So that, I think that the greater point is that he's picking up on this. This is definitely a strand of the far right, but it's not something outrageous. He's just kind of put a new spin on it in the most extreme version of it. Because DeSantis isn't coming out and immediate capitulation of Putin. Trump more or less is as well. Again, he's not really articulated it as clearly as what Ramaswamy is proposing.
Yeah, so that's just one aspect. Another aspect, which you say he's trying to take back, but certainly was in this American conservative piece, is that we would basically protect Taiwan for 4 years while we developed our own semiconductor industry. And as soon as we were no longer dependent on Taiwan for semiconductors, because this is only going to take 4 years, despite how many years it takes to build a fab, but then we would no longer feel this need to protect Taiwan.
Right. Which was completely contradictory of, we're going to be tough on China. They're the big threat. And, we're going to let them take this very strategic, important and would be a devastating loss to American power within the Pacific. Just let them take Taiwan, because I don't need them for semiconductors anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Really extraordinary. He apparently has had to back away from that comment, because the thing is, even the right, so Fox News is like nailing him about this because it's just naturally contradicted. Everybody on the right in the mainstream foreign policy establishment, everybody within Congress is like, oh yeah, China's the enemy and we have to defend Taiwan. There's nobody out there saying, let's throw Taiwan under the bus. There's nobody that isolation. There's nobody isolationist around China. It's a Asia first policy, if anything, but he's kind of the purist towards drawing in, securing our borders, punishing Mexico, and invading them as necessary, but a very 1930s isolationist America, like the purest form of it.
Yeah, and he kind of wants like other countries to do more, I think, deterring China too. Like he wants to give nuclear submarines to India.
Yeah, including part of the AUKUS.
He wants to transfer our military technology to India.
I did see that. You know, I'm not in disagreement with. I mean, I think there's opportunity for the American defense providers to get the Indian military off of Russian equipment. I think that's positive, but I don't know full technology transfer.
That's just building a new rival. I mean, India is huge. Eventually, it could surpass China, and it could be a new rival if you just give them technology transfers. I mean, now it's hard to imagine, but when we first engaged with China, it was very hard to imagine too.
Are you trying to allude that he's a sleeper agent or something? That's not fair. No, we wouldn't do that. That's definitely what, if he is a Democrat, that's definitely what Republicans would have.
I'm just saying, like, when we first engaged China, when Nixon talked them out, like China was devastated.
And still in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution didn't end until 1976.
So when we engaged with China, too, this is what with Russia, China was nothing economically, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they weren't engaged with the world at all.
So I'm just saying that you plant the seeds of a rivalry with India in 30 years.
Yeah, I think that's
I'm sure no one is thinking that.
I think it's an interesting thing. It definitely came to my mind, like how we would approach, because when we look at we talk about the demographics of China and compare that to India, completely different camps. Now, economically, India's way behind China, but you're right. In 30 years, given this shift in investment, India could very well be a major power in the world. And how would we treat that? Maybe we saw how we would treat that with Japan. That it's not necessarily just, their system's more aligned, although they have certainly lost some of the democratic elements under Modi. But yeah, would we be as threatened? Would it be just as we'd see something similar that we saw in the 1980s with Japan, even though they were both democracies? I don't know.
I think so. Anyway, I just thought the technology transfer.
That
we
was
can't build the submarines to get to Australia, let alone for ourselves.
That's true.
So we don't have any capacity right now to build submarines for India.
Yeah, there was
just a lot of problems.
There was that. And I think the most controversial for Republicans was also his Israeli policy.
Oh, yes, to stop funding Israel.
To stop funding Israel. I don't know if that was a precondition to kind of normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab states. And then at that point, we're out.
I think that was it.
Yeah.
I think that's what he said.
Yeah.
And we're out. And that included funding Israel.
Yeah.
Which Israel depends on that amount of money. We give them a large amount of money, military aid. That's how they manage their relationships with the Palestinians. It's really kind of unthinkable that we would ever end that aid.
Yeah, so we're creating like enormous power vacuums throughout kind of all of the critical regions and thinking that won't blow back on U.S. interests, the U.S. economy.
And then, like I said, he just says like, oh, and all the Australia, Japan, I think India too, we're just going to tell them to like spend a lot more money on their defense. So I wanted to point out, Japan actually already made the move to spend a lot more money on their defense. But you can't just tell countries to spend more money on their defense.
Also acting like we haven't done that constantly too. I think every single administration since the Cold War has basically told our allies to spend more money on defense. I think what Trump implies is that, you create the economic punishment if they don't.
Yeah.
Which then just,
but he doesn't articulate that.
Yeah, which is why Nikki Haley tore him apart and told him that he clearly understands nothing about foreign policy or that kind of balance that has to exist between kind of each party's national interest and incentives.
Yeah, he doesn't understand foreign policy.
No.
Not that Trump did either, but he's trying to make a serious platform.
You got to take it seriously because it's the dominant platform of the Republican nominee.
I guess here's my thing, though. Like, how seriously am I supposed to take it if there's
pretty seriously?
But I'm more concerned about getting rid of the education department and the FBI and the IRS. I have to admit.
That's concerning too. That's happening either way.
I mean, he can say this is what his foreign policy is going to be, but it can't be this.
Again, the president has wide range and the ability to try to implement these policies. And just even if he's unsuccessful, the damage that would cause around the world, around our national interest would be extreme. Even if none of them are successful. Most of Trump's policies weren't successful, but they caused enormous damages to our alliances.
Yeah.
And it's too early to take polls seriously, but it looks like things are going to be tight between a Trump and Biden election. Real tight. Disturbingly tight for somebody facing 91 felony charges against them.
Republicans don't care.
Which is an issue. So we could very well be staring at the barrel of all of these policies being on the plate and them heavily targeting the federal bureaucracy in January 2025.
Yeah, but I don't know what we do about it. All this is just like, look at how horrifying the world could be. And we know from 2016 that the world can really be this horrifying. But yeah, so this is a foreign policy proposal. I think one difference from, I don't think Trump laid out a serious foreign policy agenda like this. Oh, but you know what Trump did write?
What?
This week? I think it was this week.
Trump wrote something?
Yeah, like it was in the Wall Street Journal or something.
Really?
And it was about how we need more tariffs on China.
Oh, yeah, nice. Okay.
And the argument is sort of like, there's still this huge trade deficit, which of course got worse after the initial.
Yeah.
So
he's fixated on the deficit. Yeah.
So people were like, wait, so you're tacitly admitting that the first tariffs didn't work.
Right.
So we put on more tariffs?
Yeah.
How's that supposed to work?
Yeah, it's going to work eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. So
nice.
That's, yeah.
Okay. That's the whole article? Let's just put more tariffs on China?
I think it was just like an opinion piece or something like that in the Wall Street Journal. I forgot to look it up.
All right, well, I'll have to check that out.
So that's where Trump's foreign policy is.
Yeah. Well, he's getting lots of fresh ideas. That's all I'm saying.
It's true.
He's definitely going to incorporate a lot of these in Trump 2.0.
To the extent that he can. That this makes any sense at all.
Didn't stop him before.
Well, after that, always ending on such a positive note, you have the world that could be. I think this brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me, AR Kellogg.
And you can reach us by email, so Nita at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see the show notes for all the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like the show, please take time, tell your friends, share it on your social media sites. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.